we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This phrase echoes in the Declaration of Independence, and what a great honor it is for us to be an American. It is an honor to be a part of the government for the people, by the people. One of the many rights that this honor entitles us to is the right to vote. However, many Americans choose not to participate in that right. The United States Congress should pass laws that encourage voter participation. First, I will show that Americans lack in voter participation. Then, I will emphasize the importance of voting. Next, we will see the negative effects of a low voter turnout. And lastly, I will show how we can increase voter participation in the United States. Low voter participation in the United States is a problem. Drew Desilver, an analyst for the Pew Research Center, in his 2019 article, U.S. Trails Most Developed Countries in Voter Turnout, notes that in the 2016 presidential election, the United States had a 55.7 voting age population participation rating. This means that only half of Americans went to the polls for an election, and elective officials are now only representing half of the American population. This results in unequal representation and policies being passed that don't correlate with the majority of Americans. But it seems that the country is functioning just fine without these voters. So why does it matter? It matters because the policies that are being put in place aren't always in correlation with the wishes and wills of the majority of Americans. Nick Switzenak, a data and social scientist, in the 2019 article Minority Rule, highlights that senators on average only needed 29% of the American electorate to gain their seat at the Capitol. These senators are representing their voters. They're advocating for policies that their voters want. However, that's only 29% of the American people. This is important because the policies being made are in favor of the 29% as opposed to the rest of all Americans. This unfair representation isn't only seen at the state and capital level, but can also be seen here locally in southern Minnesota. The Blue Earth Area School District recent referendum lost by a total of 756 votes to 721 votes, according to Kevin Mertens from the Faribault County Register. The Office of the Secretary of State in Minnesota reports that there are 8,122 registered voters in Faribault County. Half of these voters belong to the United South Central School District. This means that only 1,477 voters out of 4,061 registered voters in the Blue Earth Area School District voted on the referendum. This means only 36% of registered voters decided the fate of the school's budget. This can be harmful because voting decides who makes the policies that govern us and policies that determine the way we live our lives. Emily Chapman, a professor at Stanford University, in her 2019 article, The Distinctive Value of Elections and the Case for Compulsory Voting, emphasizes that low voter turnout degrades many key democratic values. Because democratic values include equal representation for each person, it makes sense that when people aren't voting, they aren't getting represented, and that's degrading the value. Socially, this can be harmful, and we'll use the referendum as an example. Because only 36% of the people determine the result of the budget, the school now has to make budget cuts. This cut will include teachers being fired, extracurricular activities being ended, and students not receiving the help and support they need to succeed. And economically, there are also harms. Sean McElwee, a social activist, in his 2014 article, Why the Voting Gap Matters, found that in the 2010 midterm elections, only 26% of people earning less than $10,000 a year voted. This is important because the richer a person is, the more likely they are to vote. But it's the poor population in the United States that needs help from the government to succeed. However, because only 26% of these people are voting, their needs and voices aren't heard by politicians. It is clear that the government does not accurately represent the will of the people because of a low voter turnout. Luckily, there are some ways we can increase voter turnout in the United States. The solution involves two key points. The first is initiating compulsory voting laws, and the second is making Election Day a national holiday. Compulsory voting laws require a person to show up to the polls on Election Day. However, they do not require the person to actually cast a vote, because that would infringe upon their right to do so. Instead, if a person does not show up to the polls on election day, that person will be susceptible to a small fine because of the law. The law is not very strict, nor is it a harsh punishment. Instead, it's simply initiated to increase people's willingness to go vote. Making Election Day a national holiday will further support that because Americans will not have to go to work on Election Day, and making it a holiday will create traditions that celebrate democracy and voting. Compulsory voting has shown to be effective. In De Silva's article, he notes that Chile's voting age population percentage participation dropped in 2016 from 87% to 42% when Chile changed its law from compulsory voting to voluntary voting. And although compulsory voting has shown to be effective, there are some oppositions. Chapman recognizes and argues against some of these oppositions. The first is that compulsory voting will cause Americans to vote out of fear instead of civil duty. But Election Day should help support Americans' authentic choice to vote because it'll become an American tradition to do so. In addition, then the law, which is defined as a common social practice to vote, will further emphasize Americans' willingness to do so. The second opposition is that high voting participation is not essential to create a democracy. However, this is on the basis that less educated or less passionate Americans can rely on their peers to vote for them. But as Thomas Jefferson once said, "I know of no safer depositor of the ultimate powers of society than the people themselves, and if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise control with wholesome discretion, then the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform them of their discretions through education." What Thomas Jefferson is saying is that although Americans might not always make the best decisions, it is a democratic practice to allow them to make decisions for themselves. Doing so will create many benefits. The first is that there will be accurate representation for all Americans, and that will create better equality, not only economically, but also socially. Every American will be treated fairly by the government and have equal representation. You now know that Americans lack in voter participation and that voting is important. You know the negative effects of a low voter turnout and how we can change a low voter turnout in the United States. The United States Congress should pass these laws to increase voter participation. But in order to get Congress to do so, it starts with you. You have to vote and make your opinions heard, not only on voter participation, but on government policies in general. So in order to make the changes and your voice heard, go vote as soon as possible.